This video is for new game masters who have run few or no games yet, or for experienced game masters who might be curious about the process of other game masters like me. In a previous video, I went over some ways to get started running your first adventure. In this one, I'll go into more detail about how I do game prep myself. What I'll show you here is an example of how one experienced game master does it, but by no means is it the only or even the best approach. It's what works for me. So take the pieces that work for you and ignore the parts that don't. In particular, some of the approach I take is a little tailored to help me with the aspects of ADHD that I happen to struggle with the most, namely poor working memory and difficulty staying focused while reading source books. But even if you don't struggle with these things, I do believe that this approach smooths out the process for anybody. Now, although I'll discuss how to work with a published adventure in this first chapter, the rest of the video is still useful even if you're rolling your own story for players. Here are the topics I'll cover. Reading the adventure. How to take in a published adventure in the most effective way. Session prep. How to prepare notes for an individual session. And then ongoing prep. How to organize your thoughts and concerns about sessions between sessions. Okay, let's talk about how to read a published adventure to prepare for running it at the table. As much as I love to read gaming materials, tabletop RPG books are dense and, from a certain perspective, pretty dry reading. There are no characters pulling you through a written-out story with their emotional stakes. In fact, that's the part the players will fill in with their characters and how they play. Instead, you're reading everything else about the story, including multiple possible paths the story could take. Basically, you get all the exposition and nothing else. This can make for challenging reading that can sometimes feel a bit like studying at school, but at least it's about cool topics and topics I enjoy studying. This feeling can be especially overwhelming with the types of adventures that are popular and commonly published today, which are entire campaigns in one book, like Curse of Strahd or Out of the Abyss. There's just a lot to take in. The first thing you should do is read the front and back matter, and then browse the table of contents to get a feel for the structure and how the information is organized. In other words, take a top-down approach and deal with the general info first. There's usually an NPC section, for example, so take some time to browse that and just get a feel for how many of them there are and if you notice any theme about them at a glance. You're not reading for detail here, but what you're doing is giving your mind a context for the reading you're going to do, which will make it easier to read and absorb at a detailed level later. Basically, you're browsing the entire buffet quickly and taking a sample bite here and there while planning how to fill your plate. Next, you're going to read the adventure book, yes, from cover to cover. That is, if you're doing it the way I do it. Some GMs do not do this and instead skim the book to get the gist of things while planning to read the detailed stuff right at the table and deal with it then. And that works great for some of them, but not for me. I need to know what to expect, and I need to have my mind ready. The way ADHD works for me is that I have very poor working memory, so it's hard for me to jump between different ideas and context during the game already. And when you add to that new information, even in small chunks, it can just be overwhelming for me. So it's better for me to minimize the amount of new things I'm reading right at the table during the session. But also, if you're like me, while you're doing this full reading of the adventure text, you might struggle with the feeling that you must fully understand every sentence and every paragraph while you're reading through it. And you'll also have this strong feeling that you're going to have to memorize it and fully remember every bit of it during the game session at any point so that you won't have to look any of it up during play. Well, here comes some good news. If that's how you tend to feel, the first thing I have to tell you is let go of all of that. Would it be ideal if you could ingest and remember every scrap of detail about the entire adventure just by reading it through once? Well, of course it would, but that's so impossible that trying to do it is actually, paradoxically, going to make your comprehension worse, and it's definitely going to slow you down. And above all, you'll get frustrated at trying to do the impossible to the point that you might just feel like giving up. Just accept at the outset that you're going to need to read portions of the content again, for example, while prepping individual game sessions to refresh yourself on the information. Trust that process and trust yourself, and it'll go better. If you hit a section that isn't clicking for some reason on the first read, or you just don't really understand something about it, don't try to force that understanding. You can make a note of it and move on if you want, but a first read through, you're usually going to have spots like this. So just realize that's very normal and don't sweat it too much. Come back later, take another look at it. It's often the case that after a full read through, something else you come across in the book will explain the earlier bit that didn't make sense at first. And if that doesn't happen, give your mind a break for a while and then come back to those sections that didn't seem to make sense on the first read-through. Above all, don't demand too much of yourself on the first read-through. Relax and do what you can. You also might want to try reading at a slightly faster pace than you usually do when reading other kinds of text, like news, stories, or novels. I'm not suggesting the speed reading style when you just skim for keywords. Do read every word like you usually would, but push yourself to do it at a just slightly faster than normal pace, because this can actually make the process of reading more engaging. It's a little paradoxical. You'll feel like you should read slowly and carefully in order to absorb every detail, but really, it's better to read a little faster and let the content kind of pour and flow into your brain. Reading a little faster this way also helps you avoid the temptation to just get stuck on details and concepts that need a little time to absorb. Basically, put the words in your brain and then let your brain absorb them naturally, rather than trying to squeeze out every bit of meaning from every single word or phrase. It can also help to take notes as you read. They don't need to be especially thorough or detailed, but taking notes helps you to remember important points better and is another thing that can help keep your mind engaged in the task of reading. A way that I like to do this is by taking notes within a mind map. A mind map is a free-form spatial layout of structured information. I think of it as a two-dimensional outline. Mind maps look something like this, which is the mind map I made to plan this video. I use an online app called Gamemaster that I really like, but there are several such apps you can try. This works great with my ADHD brain for a couple of reasons. One is that it's a process of externalizing information, so I don't have to try to hold it all in my poor working memory. And the layout is more spatial than sequential, like it would be in a traditional top-down outline. Spatial memory is really powerful in the human brain for making things stick and understanding the relationships between information. Another thing is that with this spatial layout, I can flit quickly from subtopic to subtopic, adding other tangential notes as the thoughts occur, rather than trying to think about the whole outline top to bottom from the very beginning. Mind maps are really useful for taking notes on interdependent events, locations, or for NPCs and their relationships and motivations. Here's an example of the kind of mind map notes I took while reading about 3 characters in the Book of Many Things. I read this section a few times, but the 3 characters and their names just wouldn't arrange themselves right in my brain. So then I put them this way in a mind map and almost instantly grasped their relationships and their qualities. It's just a nice way of simplifying complex structures. Now you've read through the adventure and understand it. Your players have created their characters, and you're ready to plan your first play session. If it's a D&D game, I will copy links to the D&D Beyond pages for the monsters, NPCs, and any magic items that I think will appear in the session, so I can go right to the reference for them. But if it's some other game system with no online index source material like that, I just make a note of the relevant name, and I'm okay with looking it up in a book during game time. But if you really want everything at your fingertips to keep things moving along, you might want to write down page numbers for these things or set multiple bookmarks ahead of time. Next, I do the heart of the prep work, which is jotting down a few notes and thoughts, in particular, triggers I'm likely to forget during the actual session. For example, that something needs to happen during the PC's first long rest. Or sometimes there's a tidbit of information they need to discover to move the story along, but there are several possible ways they might come to it, and I'm not sure which one that will be. Or if it might come up in some way the book didn't even cover. Anything dynamically like this, I usually put into a bullet list. I like to use bullet lists and outlines as much as possible because they're easy to scan when you're trying to cherry pick some information, and you don't want to be sifting through a wall of your own text during a play session. I've also begun laying out my session prep notes as mind maps sometimes too, since it tends to be easier to cherry pick information I need when it's laid out spatially like that. When I want something specific to happen in a session, but I don't want the players to feel too railroaded into it, I'll jot down different ways that thing might happen. For example, in the first session, there's usually a big question of what gets the story rolling and how the characters get involved in whatever event kicks it off. This is pretty similar to lists you'll actually see right there in the adventure text, often titled something like Ways the Player Characters Might Get Involved in the Crisis. But the adventure book can't anticipate every last possibility, and it certainly can't address specific things about your PCs either. So you can take the same approach the book does to tailor things to your needs, namely by making your own lists like this. Now, in prep sessions after the first one, you'll often continue trying to think of ways to tailor the adventure to your PCs, to nudge them towards certain things that advance the plot, and so on. Think ahead about the possibilities and keep bullet listing like you did for the initial adventure hook for session 1. An example of this is from a game session I ran recently in which, unbeknownst to the PCs, there was a warrant for their arrest in the town they were traveling to. I knew they'd reach the town by this session, but I had a problem. The town guards would be no match for the PCs if the PCs decided to resist arrest. But I needed them to come to a hearing before the town's burgomaster to reveal some things that would advance the story. I wondered how to handle this. So to prep for it, I came up with a couple of lists of possibilities. The first list was other factors that might encourage the PCs not to resist, such as having an already established NPC ally be there with the guards to smooth things over and encourage the party to talk to the burgomaster. The other list was how to handle the resistance if it did happen, and that list included things like having another NPC or faction in town get involved on the PC's behalf, or perhaps outlaws or a group of the burgomaster's rivals who stick their noses in. Having said all of that, and even though this video is about how prep can be done, also remember that there is no way to prepare for every possible thing that can happen in a game. Always remember you'll need to get comfortable with improvising. And as I often say to new game masters watching this channel, trust yourself. Cultivating a trust in your ability to handle the unexpected on the fly is also a vital part of game prep. Now, you may be wondering how far ahead you need to do your detailed prep for a given session. This is really hard to estimate because of all the unknowns you just can't account for. Sometimes players will surprise you by breezing through a scenario that you thought would take the whole session or even longer, but sometimes they'll also surprise you by only getting through only a small portion of what you planned. And there's nothing wrong with either of these things as long as the players are enjoying the game and they feel like the pace is okay. Unfortunately, there's really no way to get precise with this. What you can do is take your best guess at how far ahead to prep and then be ready to adjust based on what really happens in the game. In other words, be both ready and flexible. Here's how to do that. First of all, be sure to maintain a high-level view of the whole adventure. Keep your mind fresh on where the PCs have been, what they have done, and what still awaits them. The big picture. Before you begin your very first session prep, do be sure you've read the entire adventure through at least once. Then keep refreshing yourself on the high-level adventure arc and events as sessions go on. Check in at least a little bit with this during each session prep you do. In a campaign-length adventure, it's easy to forget these details over time. Be sure you've got your head around the general plot lines, big events with the PCs, and the PC's backstory elements that you want to bring into the game. In other words, don't lose the forest for the trees. The reason that's important is because if a play session goes past what you've had prepared, you can at least do informed improvising if you've got your head around the general direction of the game and the possible places it could go. Second, have some flexible encounters and scenarios ready to drop in. Things that could happen just about anywhere in the game world and at just about any time. These are the aces you can have up your sleeve for times like this. They're really handy if the players take a sudden left turn into an area or an event you weren't ready for yet. They buy you time until you can do more prep between sessions. In a game like D&D, this is often a combat encounter, which works great for a couple of reasons. One is, D&D is already a game tailored toward tactical combat, and that's part of its fun, so it's not jarring to have combat break out in a D&D game, and in fact, it's pretty expected. Another is that combat tends to slow game time down, while hopefully still being fun and engaging for the players, so it'll eat up a chunk of game session time. But it doesn't have to be combat, and in some tabletop RPGs that aren't so driven by combat, it could be strange to have fighting suddenly break out. In that case, just have some roleplay scenarios or challenges ready that could happen in just about any location. The form this takes in a lot of published material is random encounter tables. There are usually instructions about how to roll on the table and how often you should do so, but there's nothing keeping you from turning to one anytime you want, nor is there anything forcing you to roll randomly instead of just picking one that fits the moment. Remember, this material is a set of guidelines around a bunch of ideas, but you can use them however you want. Now let's go a little deeper into doing prep as the adventure goes on from session to session. I take an approach here that is centered on coming up with productive questions and then clarifying and expanding those questions until an answer gets teased out. And when this works, it feels a bit like magic. The idea is to clearly define the questions you have before you start thinking of solutions. I used to be a professional software developer, and in that world, this is called thinking in the problem space. Define the problem as best you can first, and then try to solve it. Too often, our tendency is to jump into the solution space without spending enough time in the problem space. You get good at working in the problem space by learning to ask better and better questions. Here's what I mean. Let's say you've decided it's time to get a player character's family involved somehow in the adventure to try to raise the stakes for that character. Well, the initial question seems to be, How do I get the family involved? But this isn't the final kind of question we need. In fact, very generally speaking, how questions aren't the good, clarified questions, but they are usually where we have to start. But instead of trying to answer it right away, since we don't have one, we'll ask more questions, clarifying questions, until we get at the really right questions. So a knock-on question we could have might be, who is the family member? Who, what, where, and why questions are usually clarifying question territory. This one's going to be based on the player character's backstory and origins, and it's actually not too difficult to answer as long as they have those things. One thing or another will naturally draw you to one of the family members. Let's say our PC's name is Dash Riprock, and he has a brother, Arnold. Dash's player wrote that Arnold is Dash's younger brother, and Arnold looks up to Dash. Arnold thinks Dash's adventuring life is awesome, and so he wants to become an adventurer someday too. We notice this interesting little detail while we look over the backstory. Now, an obvious approach might seem to be having Arnold do something rash to impress his brother, like trying to infiltrate a crime syndicate and getting himself captured or kidnapped in the process. Maybe the gang sends a ransom note to Dash. But there's a big question in our face here that you might not think of at first, and that question is, why does Dash care? Players have a way of surprising you with things like this sometimes. Dash's player might decide that his little brother has always annoyed him, and now he feels that Arnold should get himself out of the mess he created. All we know from the backstory the player wrote is that Arnold admires Dash, but he wrote nothing about how Dash feels about Arnold, so he's free to make this choice in-game. Now, you might say we could prevent that by asking the player to write the nature of their relationships specifically in the backstory. And that's true, and maybe even something you want to think about when you work with your players on character creation, to make sure they define not only any family members, but what each side of the relationship looks like. But here's the thing. It isn't possible to prevent every last thing like this by building up a bunch of rules about how players must write their backstories. Something is going to slip through. And anyway, you don't want to be controlling and restrictive about backstories because, frankly, it's already challenging enough to get many players to come up with them. Don't make it harder for them. So getting back to our planning, why should Dash care? That's a great question and a clarifying question, and it can lead us to more. For example, what do the brothers have in common? How do their parents feel about their sons? Is there something else you know Dash does care about that you can tie into this, maybe even changing his regard for Arnold? All these are great questions. Now, I find what works best for me is giving these questions some time and space to slow cook in my subconscious. I let them sink in. Rather than spending one marathon prep session right before an upcoming game session, I prefer to spend about 30 minutes a day for a week or more leading up to that play session, just checking in on my questions list in a low-pressure sort of way. I reread the open questions and see if any answers come to mind. Very often, great answers will just surprise me when I turn my attention back to the question. But sometimes I get more clarity for even better questions, and if answers don't come right away for those, then they sit and simmer in the prep notes until the next day. If I hit the 30-minute minimum, I can quit prepping until next time, but if some ideas are really flowing and I happen to have the time, I'll let the prep session go longer so I can capture the good stuff. Of course, not all the answers are going to get served to you on a silver platter by your working subconscious, although you might be genuinely surprised by how often this does happen if you relax into it. But in cases where I don't have answers when I'm close to game day, I turn to brainstorming to answer the open questions that are important for the session. What I do is write out a minimum of 10 possible answers to the question in a list as rapidly as possible and without judging them. They can be absolutely stupid answers. It doesn't matter. The only point is to not stop until I have 10. At least 10. What usually happens is I'll have a few answers that I don't think are great, but I write them out. Then it feels like I'm out of ideas, but I stick with it. Then I'll write a few ridiculous answers just to keep the flow going. I might again feel empty of ideas, but then fairly often a brilliant idea will come out of nowhere. This too can feel like magic, but it really works. Give it a try. It's also very important not to stop if you get an answer you really like before you come up with the full 10. Keep going anyway. Once in a while, an even more brilliant idea might come out right at the end. Now, a perhaps surprisingly important piece of doing good game prep is not something you do during an actual prep session, and that's taking notes during the gameplay session itself. Why is this important? Because reviewing play notes during your prep session will help you connect threads, remember things you need to revisit, and will keep your head around the general flow of the story. But it's important to do this in a specific way that makes it easy and fast to skim later and easy to search for things you might want to return to much later. For example, which NPC was it who told the party about the rumors surrounding the abandoned chapel, and what precise bit of info was it that they gave the party? I recently came up with what I think is a great way to do this. I have a spreadsheet called the play session log. It has columns for the real world session date, the in-game day and time something happened, the location where it happened, what the event was, and any other notes I want to take. The structure of the log makes it easy and fast to take notes in a routine way rather than writing out globs of thoughts in random paragraphs. Here's an example from a game session I ran this week. This entry says that on the road to a village called Kreshk, one of the PCs had a conversation with an NPC named Ismark. A major group was revealed who practiced something called Shalbanism. This is the first time the PCs learned of this. Ismark described what it is, and another player character who rolled for arcane knowledge knew a little about it too. Here's another example from that same session, which is part of a Curse of Strahd campaign. The party was planning to escort an NPC, Irina, safely to another town while she was in disguise. She had a hat of disguise, and she had to decide who the disguise would be based on. On the spot, improvising, I decided she had a favorite aunt named Petrina, so she chose this as her alter ego. I made a note so I remember when it happened and would remember the name and relationship I had created. This log is also useful for having a good reference for things the players might need help remembering, like what treasure they picked up when and how much it's worth when they finally try to go sell it. Now, a lot of GMs say it's up to the players to keep track of these things because our job is complicated enough as it is. There's definitely truth to that, but nobody's perfect. And even your best note-taking players will miss some things once in a while. So if you have a quick and easy way to log these things, it helps them out as well as helping you out too. And above all, it's easy for me to glance over this log in my next prep session just to keep myself refreshed about what's going on in the game. That's probably the biggest reason why the log is important. Reviewing the log is also part of game prep. Well, those are the major pieces of my game prep approach. Let me know what you think in the comments, and let me know any tricks or techniques you like to use for your game prep. If you're a new GM and still wondering exactly where to start or what kind of published adventure to run first, check out another RPG Rundown video called You Can DM, 5 Steps to Become a Dungeon Master. And thanks for watching.